On September 28, 1781, the British Army, under the command of Major General Lord Cornwallis, led his army into the Bay City of Yorktown, Virginia. Before we can tell you about this battle, let us notice some important events that led up to the final great battle of the Revolutionary War.
In July 1778, the British Army evacuated all troops to go to New York City so that the city could be their new main base of operations. On December 29, 1778, the British troops took over the port city of Savannah, Georgia. They held this city until their departure on their own accord on July 11, 1781. In July 1780, Rochambeau and the French army arrived in Newport, Rhode Island to join the Allied cause. Rochambeau would prove to be a huge member of the siege of Yorktown. On October 7, 1780, the Loyalist forces were annihilated at the Battle of Kings Mountain. On September 28, 1781, Cornwallis and his army enter Virginia.
All these events led up to the interesting decision for Cornwallis to take his troops into Yorktown. The generals leading their troops into battle were Major General Lord Cornwallis for Britain, Major General of the Continental Army George Washington, and the French General Rochambeau, who was fighting with the Americans for freedom. At 5 a.m., the Patriot Army and their French counterparts left Williamsburg, Virginia, to meet General Cornwallis's troops at Yorktown. Washington had the American-French army organized into 3 divisions for the siege.
1. Rochambeau commanded the 7,800-man French contingent. They occupied the left wing or northwestern sector of the siege line. It consisted of 3 infantry brigades, a heavy cavalry corps, and a large artillery corps.
2. The American troops formed the base of the right or southern sector with 2 wings of 8,845 troops. These were divided into 3 divisions. They were commanded by Brigadier General Benjamin Lincoln and Major Generals Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben. Colonel Henry Knox was in command of the artillery, engineers, sappers, and miners. Colonel Stephen Moylan was in charge of the cavalry.
3. The 3rd Division of 3,200 Virginia militiamen was commanded by Brigadier Generals George Wheaton, Edward Stevens, and Robert Lawson. They accompanied the southeastern sector or far right wing of the siege line. The attack formation was a 2-mile arc around the British troops.
The British managed to camp out in Yorktown for 1 month without giving up, but by October 14, 1781, the combined forces of the French-American army had enough of the foolishness. With the British fleet of ships in the bay, and now a rebel army about to charge, the ships had no way of getting to them. Things looked a little dim for the British army. The fighting began on the 14th, and Cornwallis ordered at least 10,000 or more of his soldiers to try to flee from Yorktown across the York River.
The battle was long and hard for the tattered, beaten, and also cornered British army. However, a little before that, the French Navy that outweighed the British Navy by more than 100 ships came with a load of ammunition and destroyed the British Navy in less than 4 hours. Washington made all batteries open fire against the British Army to wipe out a first wave of foot soldier and Hessians. By the nightfall, the Allied forces had taken over almost half of British and other forces.
Also that night, British General Lord Cornwallis made a legion of 350 men, commanded by Colonel Robert Abercrombie, to take out a small line of Allied cannons by spiking them. This means to disable it by driving a tapered wrought iron plug down the touch hole with a hammer until it was level and firmly embedded in the cannon. On October 16, 1781, the Allied forces brought in another line of cannons to hopefully seal the victory for the Allies. Washington made every living soul fire on the British for the rest of the night, and by the time they stopped, Cornwallis and his deputies had made a final decision. Their predicament was utterly hopeless. Thus ended the last hope of the British Army, wrote Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton. On October 17, 1781, a drummer came with another man who was carrying Cornwallis's white handkerchief to say that they surrender. Washington told his second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, to go ahead and accept the surrender, for he had surrendered to Henry Clinton at Charleston, May 13, 1781. Cornwallis, who was reportedly ill that day, sent Brigadier General Charles O'Hara to surrender for him.
It is reported that the British all laid down their weapons and played an old Scottish tune adapted called The World Turned Upside Down.
On the same day of the surrender, a fleet of British ships, unaware of their surrender, comes to help the British Army, but sees they are overrun with American soldiers. So they return home to New York, only to be taken prisoner of war in the port. This loss finally ended a horrible Southern campaign that was intended to get Loyalists to sign on to their cause. The final blow was that Marquis de Lafayette made Cornwallis and his remaining 8,000 troops march all the way back to Washington for a final trial and transport.
After the battle.
After a 6.5-year war, it looked as if the war was finally over. There were a few minor after-skirmishes, and only a few men on either side died. The day came that a treaty had to be made that signaled the end of the war and America's rip from greatness. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3rd, 1783, in Paris, France, signified that the war was over and that America was a free country. This marked the first time in world history that any country has ever ripped away from Europe reign. Later on, Major General George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. This is a summary of the greatest and final battle of the United States Revolutionary War. This is a huge turning point in American history because it ended a huge David and Goliath battle that showed America could hold its own against anyone.